the only contact I really had is pretty much when I was watching Star Wars. That was for me the science fiction. But here it is, a couple of decades later, I have the honor to introduce a real astronaut. So first allow me to say a few things about Dr. Fisher. Well, she was a mission specialist on Space Shuttle missions, STS-51A, the second flight of the orbited Discovery, which launched from Kennedy Space Center on November 8, 1984. Dr. Fisher was assigned to a flight 2 weeks before delivering her daughter and flew in space when her daughter was just 14 months old, making her the first mother in space, and she logged a total of 192 hours in space. She was born in New York City, but considers San Pedro, California to be her hometown. She holds a doctorate in medicine from the University of California, Los Angeles, and was selected by NASA to be an astronaut in 1978. She joined 5 other women as the agency's first female astronauts. During her shuttle mission, Dr. Fisher and her crew deployed 2 satellites, Canada's Anik D2 and Hughes LISAT-1, and operated the radiation monitoring equipment, device, and the 3M diffusive mixing and organic solution experiment. As the first space office mission, the crew also retrieved the Palapa B2 and Vestar 6 satellites for return to Earth. Dr. Fisher was assigned as a mission specialist on STS-61H that was planned in 1986. Unfortunately, the mission was canceled following Challenger accident. So Dr. Fisher resumed technical assignments in the astronaut office. She served on the astronaut selection board for the 1987 class of astronauts and in the Space Station Support Office, where she worked part-time in the Space Station Operation Branch. Dr. Fisher also was the crew representative supporting space station's development in the area of training operation concepts and the health maintenance facility. From 1989 through 1995, Dr. Fisher was on a leave of absence from the astronaut office to raise a family, returning in January 1996. From 1996 to 2002, during the early phase of building the International Space Station, Dr. Fisher was the chief of the Space Station branch in the capacity, the coordinator inputs to the operations of the space station for the astronaut office, working closely with the international partners and supervising assigned astronauts and engineers. Dr. Fisher plays an important role in building the foundation for the International Space Station Program, which is advancing scientific knowledge and demonstrating new technologies, making research breakthroughs not possible on Earth that will enable long-duration human and robotic exploration to the deep space. From January 2011 to August 2013, Dr. Fisher served as the ISS capsule communicator, CAPCOM, working in the Mission Control Center, and was the lead CAPCOM for Expedition 33. Most recently, Dr. Fisher was a management astronaut working on display development for Orion NASA, new spacecraft which will take astronauts further into the solar system than ever before. Please welcome Dr. Fisher.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you this evening. I'm very passionate about the space program and spaceflight. And so I'm going to try to get started right away because I have a lot of things I'd like to cover with you, and I want to definitely leave time for questions and answers at the end of my talk. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I always like to start out with a picture of when I was a child because I talked to lots of different audiences. I guess my toughest audience actually was a preschool audience where my presentation didn't work. And try talking to 3-year-olds without slides. It was quite a challenge. But I like to include a picture of when I was younger. Is this on? Yeah. Just because particularly when I'm talking to younger audiences, so that they'll know that you actually were a child once and you didn't just suddenly pop out as an astronaut. But it also reminds me to talk about a couple other things, which is that when I was a child, I was really definitely a nerd, a science nerd. I loved math, I loved science. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but when I was 12 years old, my family was stationed in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I remember we were outside early in the morning with our PE teacher, listening to Al Shepard, who was the first American to launch into space. listening as he spoke with Mission Control. And at that moment, I decided that sounded like it was so exciting, a wonderful way of combining math and science with exploration, all things I love, and that I wanted to be an astronaut. But of course, it didn't seem like a very realistic goal. There were only 7 astronauts at that time in the United States, the Mercury 7, and they were all male and they were all test pilots. Women weren't even allowed to fly high-performance jets in the U.S. military, so it didn't seem like a very realistic goal. But the seed was planted that was what I wanted to do, and if there was any way, I was going to try to figure out how to do that. My father was in the military. We traveled all over. When he retired, we were in Los Angeles, and I was in 8th grade. I was 13 years old, and 8th grade was my 13th school. So we basically moved an average of every year while I was growing up. So it was really, I was really happy that for middle school and high school, I got to be in one place. And was very fortunate to have teachers that really encouraged me. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and so was very fortunate when I applied and got accepted at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and got my degree in chemistry. But as I did research for my research advisor, I really enjoyed that, but I felt like I wanted to combine my love of math and science with working with people. Decided to go to medical school and was fortunate to be accepted also at UCLA Medical School. I hadn't totally given up on my idea of wanting to be an astronaut, though, although it looked less and less likely that that was going to happen in my career lifetime. And in the back of my mind, I still thought, well, maybe someday I can be a doctor on a space station if I don't get to be a career astronaut. So I hadn't totally given up, but it certainly didn't seem like it was a very likely event. I was just finishing my internship at one of the hospitals in Los Angeles when I found out, quite by accident, one of my friends in medical school was a real fan of NASA and received a NASA newsletter and happened to see this advertisement where they were looking for not only pilot astronauts, but mission specialist astronauts or science astronauts. And it was 1 month before the deadline. And back in those days ago, of course, we didn't have the internet. And so the application process was, we had to call NASA. My then fiance, later husband, also wanted to be an astronaut. And we had to call NASA, get them to mail applications to us, get our transcripts, our letters of recommendation. So it took a good month, really working hard to get all of that together. And I got my application in one day before the deadline. And it was such a surreal experience. I remember filling out this application, which is the application in the United States to work in the government. So any position filled out the same application, but when they asked what job you were applying for, I was writing in mission specialist astronaut. And it was just really surreal. And then after that, it all happened really very quickly. My application was in on June 30th, and by mid-August, I was invited to Houston to interview in the first group of women that ever interviewed, and I think it was the second group of mission specialists. So that was in August, and then in January of 1978, found out that I was very fortunate to be in the first class of astronauts ever selected specifically for the Space Shuttle Program. There were 35 of us, and 15 of them were pilots, 20 were mission specialists. It was the largest class NASA had ever selected up until this point. And still, other than the class of 1996, those were the two classes that were very large. And as I said, 15 pilots, 20 mission specialists. And as you can see, it was really the most diverse class that NASA had ever selected. And it was also the first class of women that had ever been selected in the U.S. program. 2 women had flown previously, Valentina Tereshkova for the former Soviet Union. She flew shortly after Yuri Gagarin, the first human to ever leave our planet, and Svetlana Stalinskaya, who was the first woman to do a spacewalk. And then there was a long period of time, many years, where no women flew in space until our group was selected. So starting on your left is Dr. Shannon Lucid, who's a PhD biochemist, Dr. Ray Seddon, a medical doctor like myself, Dr. Kathy Sullivan, a PhD geologist, Dr. Judy Resnick, PhD in electrical engineering, and unfortunately she was killed in the Challenger accident. Myself and Dr. Sally Ride, a PhD astrophysicist, the first American woman to fly in space, and unfortunately she passed away in 2012 from pancreatic cancer. Just in the last year, one of the artists who makes a lot of the patches, you can see I'm wearing a lot of patches, and I'll talk about my patch for my flight in a minute, but one of the artists who helps us take our ideas for our patches and actually make the drawings, made this patch for the first 6 women. And I like to think that Judy and Sally would really have approved of this as well, so kind of nice. We're based at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. As you can see, I always try to include this slide to remind myself to talk about it, because I think most people, even in the United States and certainly around the world, would probably think that we're based at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, which is where we launched from. But politics enters into everything, and President Johnson was president at the time that the Space Center was built and was being decided upon, so he decided it was going to go to Texas since he was from Texas, and hence it's called the Johnson Space Center. When you're first selected as an astronaut, you're called an astronaut candidate for about the first year. And for the current astronauts that are training to fly on the space station, International Space Station, it's more like 2 to 3 years, because they have to learn Russian. Since the shuttle is no longer flying, they fly on the Russian Soyuz out of Baikonur. But that period of time when they're seeing if you will make a good astronaut and whether you really want this job, that period you're called an ASCAN. And so it's kind of an affectionate abbreviation that NASA uses for the new astronauts. So when you finish that period, after that, everybody in the office, it's kind of like a squadron in the military, for any of you that are familiar with that. There's your main job is to be a pilot, but everybody has different jobs, like the safety officer, the person in charge of training, and the astronaut office is set up pretty much the same way. So my first job was to work in the area of spacesuits and EVAs, which is spacewalks, extravehicular activity. And when I started that job, they didn't even have a space shuttle suit, a shuttle type suit. The suit that you're seeing me wear in this slide is an Apollo suit. And Pete Conrad was the shortest of all the Apollo astronauts, so his suit was selected, but as you can see, it's still pretty big on me. But it was a great way to start out my career as an astronaut, and a lot of the tool development and things that we developed are still flying right today on the International Space Station. Physically, it's really some of the hardest training that we do at the Space Center. So as was mentioned, I was assigned to my flight in 1983, 2 weeks before I delivered my first daughter, Kristen, and I was back at the office on Monday morning to attend our 8 o'clock meeting, because I wanted them, both my colleagues and my bosses and managers, to know that although I just had a baby, this was my dream and there was no way I was not going to meet that commitment. So I really didn't get a formal leave of absence. I just was a new mom and training for my first space flight all the same year. Pretty demanding year, but also very exciting. Our our commander, Rick Hauk, was allowed Dave Walker, myself, we were the two rookies on board who hadn't flown, to come up with the concept for our patch. So that's one of the first things you want to do as an astronaut is when you get assigned to a crew is design your patch. And so Dave and I came up with this concept that there are two satellites in the middle because we were going to launch two satellites. And then also for the first time in history, we were going to go into space and bring back two satellites that were deployed from the shuttle in February of 1984. And once they were outside the payload bay, the rocket that was supposed to take them from low Earth orbit to geosynchronous orbit failed about 4 seconds into what should have been about a 4-minute burn. And so basically you have these very expensive satellites that were functioning well, but they were totally useless because they were in the wrong orbit. And so the insurance underwriters were actually the big drivers to ask NASA and actually try to force NASA to do this mission because NASA was actually a little bit uncertain because it was, no one had ever done it before and it was still kind of early in the Space Shuttle Program. But we were really excited about it and behind the scenes we're lobbying to have a chance because we thought we could do it. And so we launched the two satellites and then we retrieved the two satellites and then we had the 5 stars that represented the 5 crew members. And since I was the first mom to fly in space and because I was helping design the patch, I added a star for my daughter, Kristen. So one of the good things about training for a space shuttle mission is that most of the training takes place at the Space Center. Unlike now for the International Space Station, if any of you are perhaps interested in becoming involved in the space program, the astronauts currently train for about 2.5 to 3 years to go on board the International Space Station, and pretty much half that time they're gone because you go to all the different training centers around the world. So the shuttle flights, though, it was a shorter training period, and you really didn't have to travel a lot during your training. But about 2 to 3 weeks before you launched, you went to the Kennedy Space Center and had a practice launch with the launch control team, because the team that launches you is different than the team in mission control. And so you only get really that one opportunity to do a practice launch, and the next time you do it is going to be the morning that you actually launch. So this is a picture that was taken just after we had completed that practice launch. And my crewmates are Dale Gardner on your left. He would be doing one of the crew members doing the spacewalk. Our commander, Rick Hauk, who was also the commander of the flight when we returned to flight after the Challenger accident. Dr. Joe Allen, he would also be doing the putting on spacesuit and doing the spacewalk. Myself, I was the robotic arm operator and the flight engineer, and our pilot, Dave Walker. Also on that same trip to the Kennedy Space Center, it was the last time that the payload bay doors of the shuttle would be open so that you could get a very close-up inspection of whatever your particular payload was or your particular mission. And so here you see the 2 satellites that we were going to deploy. The one in the middle, the round cylindrical one, is a Hughes 376, and it's identical to the 2 satellites that are on orbit that we're going to retrieve, to give you an idea of how big they are. And then the other satellite towards the back of that was a communication satellite that we launched for the U.S. Navy. And you can see up in the front part of the payload bay, there's sort of a big empty space there. It's kind of hard to see through the cover that goes over the satellite. But that whole forward portion is empty because that's where we're going to put the 2 satellites that we're going to bring back. There's a lot of tradition in the space program. Well, let me backtrack. For the week before you launch, you're in quarantine, which is to prevent you from getting illnesses. We don't have backup crews, so we do everything we can to make sure that the crew that's going to fly is going to be healthy. And we were flying in November, which is around the beginning of flu season and stuff. So they minimize your contact with people who haven't had physicals and been declared that they're free of illness. And then, so for 3 days, you're in quarantine at the Johnson Space Center, and then you fly about 3 days before launch, you fly to the Kennedy Space Center in T-38s, which is part of our training. I'll show you a picture of that later in my presentation. And so you were there for the 3 days before you launch. And then on the morning of launch, there's a lot of tradition, and this is one of the traditional pictures you take at breakfast. But you can see that we're really not eating a lot or drinking a lot. And that's not because they probably haven't served us yet, but you really don't want to drink or eat a lot when you're on the morning of launch. And if any of you are fortunate enough to make enough money to pay Richard Branson so you can fly on Virgin Galactic or Elon Musk to fly on the Dragon, you might want to listen to this part of my talk because it's pretty good advice. You really don't want to drink a lot before you go into space because when you go out to the pad, if you can imagine your chair laying on its back and you're laying on the chair with your legs kind of up, that's the position you're going to be in for 3 hours before you launch. And that's true of pretty much every vehicle. And if you don't have a drop of drink by the end of those 3 hours because of that position and the blood in your legs going to your central venous system, you're going to have to go to the bathroom very badly. And you don't want to make it any worse by drinking a lot. And then the second reason you don't want to eat a lot is because a good 60% or so, I think it might actually be higher, of astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts, which is what the Chinese call their astronauts, have what's called space adaptation syndrome, just another fancy NASA term for motion sickness. The etiology is a little different than regular motion sickness, but the symptoms are identical. You don't feel well, you have stomach awareness, and if you eat something, you're going to throw up. And if you think throwing up on the ground is unpleasant, let me assure you that throwing up in space is way worse. And then you've got to figure out what you're going to do with it. And so just leave the rest up to your imagination. I decided to solve that problem by not eating anything. And although I didn't feel great, I never threw up. So this is a picture of us walking out to the Cape, to the Astrovan, which is a silver little van that takes you out to the pad to launch. Cannot tell you what a surreal experience that is, walking out and realizing that you're actually going out to launch on the shuttle, and as you're driving out there, the xenon lights are shining on this beautiful spaceship out in the distance, and you're about to go launch on it. Pretty amazing feeling. We launched on the Space Shuttle Discovery, which is now in the Udvar Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I cannot tell you how old it makes you feel when you see the spaceship you flew in a museum. But it is fun to be able, one of my daughters lives in Washington, so I get to go visit Discovery every once in a while. I was the fourth person to ingress the vehicle and get strapped in. So I had quite a bit of time to stand out on that access arm waiting for my turn. We were looking right out at the Atlantic Ocean, and it was a full moon, and I remember sitting there thinking about how this had been my dream since I was 12 years old, and here I was about to go into space, and like I said, a really surreal feeling. This is what it looks like inside the cockpit. I flew before the Challenger accident, so we basically wore flight suits like we wear when we're flying T-38s. You can see the commander up on the your upper left, the pilot on the upper right. Mission specialist one was Joe Allen, and he was on the lower right, and then I was in the seat in the middle. As I said, I was the flight engineer. And so you can see from where I'm sitting, I get a really good view of all the displays and the computer screens and all that. So my job was to make sure that we didn't forget anything, that we were staying on the timeline. And were we to have a malfunction, which thankfully during ascent we did not, make sure we were working the correct procedure and so forth. We were supposed to launch on November 7th, but we scrubbed because the winds at altitude were too high and we put too great a load on the wings. So we actually launched on November 8th, which was my crewmate Dale Gardner's birthday. And when the launch director called to wish us good luck and a successful mission, he promised not to blow the candles out. So the way the shuttle works is the shuttle is attached to this large orange external tank, which provides fuel, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen to the three main engines. And then on either side is a solid rocket booster. There's over 7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. So what I'd like to do now is I have a very brief video of ascent. And so I want to try to explain to you or describe to you what it was like the few seconds before liftoff and what ascent felt like. So imagine that you're, again, in that position. Your chair is with the back on the floor and you're laying out on the pad, and it's about 10 seconds before launch. And I'll try to explain what it was like. Sorry, it's not up on the screen. So at about 10 seconds before liftoff, you can turn the volume up as loud as you can. About 10 seconds before liftoff, the command is sent to the three main engines. The onboard computers check to see whether they're functioning properly, and then the command is sent to ignite the solid rocket boosters. And when that happens, you may not know where you're going, but you definitely know you're going somewhere. First stage, which is the time that the solid rocket boosters are burning, is probably the highest risk time, and it's also a time with a lot of vibration, a lot of noise. And as I said, I think it's probably the riskiest part of the entire flight. You have to remember that once those solid rocket boosters are ignited, there's no shutting them off. So at about 2 minutes into the flight, the command is sent from the computers to jettison the solid rocket boosters. They have parachutes, they fall into the ocean, and the folks at the Kennedy Space Center retrieve them, and they're used on about 10 missions each. And the rest of the flight is just almost like a car with an electric engine. It's just a constant acceleration, but all the vibration is gone. It's just a total smooth acceleration up until about 6 minutes into the flight. And at that point, the computer commands the engines to throttle back to maintain 3 Gs, so that if you were to weigh, say, 100 kilograms here on the ground, you'd weigh 300 kilograms for about 2 minutes or so. And so it's a little bit uncomfortable, but really not anything that it was really not very bad at all. And then in an instant, it takes 8.5 minutes to go from 0 kilometers per hour to 26.5 kilometers, 26,500 kilometers per hour, which is orbital velocity. And you do that in 8.5 minutes, just to give you an idea of just how much thrust is involved. And in an instant, at MECO, which is main engine cutoff, in that instant, you go from 3 Gs to being weightless in an instant. And you can almost feel whatever blood is left in was left in your leg after sitting on the pad for 3 hours, the rest of that blood rushing into your central venous system. And if you look at astronauts' faces, the first day or two, the first couple hours they're on orbit, their faces look really full. It really doesn't matter to a lot of you in this audience since you're young enough, but for those of us that are a little bit older, it gets rid of all your wrinkles, and it's great. You look about 10 years younger for the mission, but unfortunately they all come back when they come back to Earth. But it is a nice fringe benefit for a brief period. So now what I'd like to do is switch gears a little bit, just show you what it was like to be in space and be weightless. And I'll be happy to answer questions later if you still want more of an explanation. Although the shuttle isn't flying anymore, a lot of the things that I'll show you are very common to the International Space Station and to the other vehicles that we're working on right now that I'll talk a bit at the end of my talk about. But the shuttle was, if you can imagine, it's kind of like a small two-story apartment. And the upper flight deck that you see here, with Commander Rick sitting in the commander seat, is like pretty much like the cockpit of a commercial aircraft. A little different, but a lot of the same technology. There are over 2,000 switches, circuit breakers, and so forth in the shuttle. And most of them were on the flight deck. As compared to, for example, the Orion vehicle that we're working on, and I'll talk to you towards the end of my talk, I think it has about 25 or 30 switches because everything is controlled through the displays. And those switches are actually not used, they're just backups in case some of the computer functions don't work. So it's very, very different with the technology that's changed so much since when the shuttle was designed. And so that's the flight deck. And then the aft part of the flight deck, which is where we saw Joe and I sitting for ascent, once you get on orbit, you don't really need those seats anymore. You aren't going to sit down. Very, very rarely do you want to just sit in orbit. And in fact, they actually just get in your way. So those seats get folded and stowed. And then here you see on the right side of the screen is the panel where the commander or the pilot can fly the shuttle. And so when we rendezvous with the satellite, or later on when we dock with the International Space Station, you fly it from that aft panel, not sitting in the commander's seat like you do for ascent and entry. And then on the right side is the panel and the controls where I operated the robotic arm. So Rick would be to my left and I would be at the right, and I could look out the window and he could look out and see the satellite, and I could look out the windows and work with the robotic arm. And then there's a mid-deck area, which is below, although in weightlessness there's really not a up and a down or anything, but the other compartment, if you will, of the shuttle, just called the mid-deck, and that's where everything else takes place, where all the stowage is and the experiments that you're doing. And you can see I'm holding onto the handle of our treadmill where we got our exercise. Exercise is really important when you're in weightlessness, although our flight was only an 8-day mission. So exercise was probably not as important for that shorter period, but for the astronauts now that go up on the International Space Station for 6 months or even a year like Scott Kelly did, exercise is really important. If you have any questions, I can talk a little bit more about that too. We each had a locker where all of our personal effects and clothing were stowed. And you can see, we had stickers like where I went to UCLA, the military affiliation of my crewmates, pictures of our families, and everything was, or many of the things are color-coded. So there was red for the commander, yellow for the pilot, blue for mission specialist 1, and then green for MS2. So you can tell that, that was my locker. Or if you pick up a checklist and you wondered whose it was, you didn't have to ask. You could just see the colored band across it, and you'd immediately know. You can see I'm wearing the necklace, the same necklace I'm wearing here that I wore in space. And you can see I'm demonstrating space hair. No such thing as a flat hair day when you're in space. So that was another cool side benefit. A little bit about food in space. As I mentioned, I wasn't feeling real great the first couple of days, so I really did not want to throw up, and I really didn't eat a lot. And I woke up on the morning of the 3rd day, and I felt amazing. All the motion sickness was gone, and I was starving because I'd basically not eaten anything. And so the first thing I ate was a hot dog. And I still remember that. To me, that was the best hot dog I ever had. Probably the most expensive, too, when you calculate weight to orbit. But most of the food is very much like backpacking food for any of you that do any camping. It was freeze-dried, and you add water to it. And my favorite was beef stroganoff. This is an example of a tray that they designed for us to put the little food containers in, so you didn't have to figure out what to do with all these containers as they floated around. And you can see this is a breakfast with orange juice and coffee. Oops, I'm not going to show that video if any of you are interested. I was just showing you a lot of the same things I'm talking about, but I wouldn't be here all night if I showed you all the videos and things. A little bit about sleeping in space. On the International Space Station, each crew member has actually a little, about the size of a phone booth, little sleep compartment, if you will. Bless you. And so they actually have a little more privacy. On board the shuttle, there wasn't enough room, and we don't want to waste extra weight for habitability reasons. We wanted to have all the weight going to orbit be designed for the payload, or allocated to the payload. So we had sleeping bags. But none of my crewmates wanted to actually sleep in the sleeping bags the way they were designed. And my commander wanted to sleep in his seat up on the flight deck. Dale slept in the airlock. I have no idea where Joe slept. And what Dave and I came up with was this little arrangement where we made like a little hammocky arrangement between two sleeping bags. And it felt, that was really kind of cozy. You could kind of float in there. But you weren't going to float away. I remember the first night it felt really strange, and I really felt like I wanted a pillow. But, you know, your head's floating and everything, so you really don't need a pillow. And by about the 8th day, I actually had gotten so used to sleeping in weightlessness that this was a picture Joe took. I was taking a little power nap as we were getting ready to pack up and head home. And you can see there's a little tether from my jacket to the handle of the treadmill there. And other than that, I'm just floating and sleeping, and it was perfectly comfortable and natural. A little bit about how to go to the bathroom in space, because a lot of people want to know but don't want to ask. And so hopefully Dave is just simulating here. But the waste management system on board the shuttle is very similar to those porta potty things that you'll see at a race or a festival or something like that. And then we use vacuum suction to help things along. I think I'll just leave the rest up to your imagination. The one thing NASA added when we started flying mixed gender crews was this privacy curtain. But as you can see, you really don't have a lot of privacy when you're in space. And in some of the newer vehicles where they only have one volume, you're going to even have less than we did. So one of the things I always tell people is that you're going to get to know your crewmates very well, perhaps better than you really wanted to. So briefly, I'm just going to quickly show you a little bit about what we did on our flight, because it really was an exciting, historic mission. The first 2 days, we launched the 2 satellites that I showed you in the earlier slide, day 2 and day 3. Day 4 was a preparation day. Joe and Dale were checking out their suits in the airlock, making sure they were all functioning. Rick and I were working on getting ready to do the rendezvous together, making sure that all of our sensors and everything that we needed were working. And so then on day 5 and on day 7, we rescued the Palapa and the Westar satellites. I really don't have time to go into all the details, but if any of you are interested, I'm happy to stay and talk later about how we did it, because it was a very complicated process, because these satellites were not designed to be retrieved by anyone. No one had ever conceived that that we would be able to do that. And so the gist of the idea was Joe and Dale got into their spacesuits. They donned the backpack. I don't know for any of you that's seen Gravity, the George Clooney flying around with a backpack. Well, that's what they were copying. Other than that, that wasn't realistic. If you want to ask me questions about that later, I'm happy to answer them. But the idea of the backpack and flying over to the satellite, that worked out. And they're untethered at that point. So that's the only time you're ever not tethered to the shuttle. And we, the engineers, in conjunction with our crew, helped design this thing called a Stinger that would fly over to the satellite. And you can't tell from this slide, but the satellite's rotating at a very slow rate. And Dale docks with the aft end or the nozzle end of the satellite. And then on the side of the on the side of the Stinger is a grapple fixture, which is one way we could grab it. And then due to a problem we had, we actually wound up having Joe on the end of the arm, as you'll see in this picture. And you can see Dale has gone over to the satellite, has stabilized it, stopped the rotation rate, and maneuvered it over to where Joe, who's on the end of the arm, and I'm maneuvering the arm over. He said he felt like he was on the world's highest diving board because he could look down and all he saw was the Earth 200 nautical miles below. And then I maneuvered him over. He grabbed the satellite by hand, and Dale undocked and went into the payload bay. And then another piece of hardware was designed to go in the nozzle end because we had to figure out how to hook these big satellites into the payload bay. And so that's what they're doing in this slide. And then at the end of the second spacewalk, and you have to realize these are really long days. The rendezvous to get to the satellite takes about 6 hours. And then the spacewalk was between 6 and 7 hours. So really long days where you have to really just constantly be paying attention. So at the end of that second day, at the end of that spacewalk, to see both those satellites in the payload bay, I cannot tell you what an amazing feeling that was. And Joe and Dale felt that since we had been successful, they could bring out this little sign they made for sale, which was kind of a joke, but not really, because as I mentioned, these satellites were many, many millions of dollars, and both of them were brought back, refurbished, and sold to someone else and launched a couple of years later. And then they went up in orbit and fulfilled their full design life. So once we were done with that, we had a celebratory steak dinner after they came in, and then on the morning of the 8th day, we packed up and practiced procedures for entry, and then on the morning of the 9th day, we did our deorbit burn. And when you do the deorbit burn, you're basically firing your jets into the velocity vector to slow you down. And then once you slow down, you're basically becoming a meteor to enter the Earth's atmosphere. This is a slide one of my friends took as we went overhead Houston. And then we were the second shuttle to land at the Kennedy Space Center. And as I mentioned, the first time anyone had ever brought hardware back from space, other than the Apollo astronauts bringing back the moon rocks. But to actually bring back hardware from space, that was the first flight. And we were met by custom officials asking if we had anything to declare. I remember that once we landed, I felt like about a 300-kilogram gorilla. It was amazing to me how quickly your body adapts to weightlessness. And so when you came back, you felt extremely heavy. I had some switches that I had to throw on the overhead panel to safe the reaction control jets. And in the simulator, it probably took less than 30 seconds. And it probably took me several minutes because my arms felt so heavy. And I had to kind of lift my arm up and make sure I was on the correct switch. And so it took a lot longer. And you can see here we're all fairly unsteady on our feet. We're all holding on very carefully to the railing. because none of us wanted to be the first one to fall down on TV as you're coming out of the shuttle. But it's definitely, you're unsteady for about a day or so. And after that, they took us back to crew quarters where we were in quarantine. Took a shower, had a nice beer on the way back home to Houston. And then we landed about 7 in the morning, and by around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we were back in Houston. Another one of those really surreal feelings of being in space in the morning and back home in your bed that night. And it was the longest I was away from my daughter. She was, I could think we were separated for about 2 weeks, so it was really great to see her again. So I'm going to shift gears again, and I want to try to share with you a little bit about the amazing views that you see from shuttle. I hope some of you someday get an opportunity either as an astronaut or perhaps by buying one of those tickets on Virgin Galactic or SpaceX and get to see that amazing view. Every photographer tries to capture a perfect sunrise or a perfect sunset. And when you're in orbit, it takes 90 minutes to go around the Earth. And every 45 minutes, you're going to see either a sunrise or a sunset. It also presents a little bit of a challenge, like in spacewalks, because you only have about, at most, 7 hours before you run out of your consumables. So you have to continue working, whether it's daylight or whether it's dark. So it makes some things challenging when you have to do certain tasks in the dark. But we do have lights on the spacesuit helmet. This is the Aurora Borealis. The Mediterranean, I think you might actually catch a teeny glimpse of Cyprus at the very top of that slide, but I have some more of that. This is a slide looking into the Middle East and the Sinai Peninsula. And I think one of the things I want to emphasize on this slide is, when you're in orbit looking at this amazing planet, you don't see any borders. And it really brings home the point, especially as you look into the vast darkness opposite of the Earth. And then you look back at this amazing planet, you realize that, at least for the foreseeable future, this is the planet we have, and it's going to be quite a while before we learn how to go to Mars and beyond our solar system. So we better take really good care of it. And I know I'm trivializing history, but it also makes all the conflicts we have here on Earth seem almost, and again, I hesitate to say it, but they almost seem petty, because you look here and you think, wow, you only get this one chance to live on this Earth, and it's sad that we can't all learn to get along and have people die needlessly. So that's something that really hits you when you're on orbit. And I'm really, and many of my colleagues, I think, also are hopeful that as more people get to see this view in person, that perhaps they'll get that same feeling, and they'll help us all learn to get along a little better. This is the Himalayas, which I just love looking at the Himalayas. The daytime views are amazing, but the nighttime views are spectacular. One of my colleagues, Don Pettit, who came up with he designed the platform such that our cameras matched the orbital velocity so we could take these pictures at night. And so before that, we didn't have these pictures. And his quote, and he's probably one of the nerdiest guys I've ever known, but his quote was that the stars the cities at night are the beautiful unintended consequence of civilization. And it's really true. It's just amazing as you're flying over the different countries and seeing the cities. This is Greece, Tokyo and Tokyo Harbor, the Nile Delta and Nile River. And Africa truly is the dark continent. I mean, other than along the Nile River and along the coast, it is dark at night. The only other thing that's fun that doesn't show up on this slide is watching lightning propagate across hundreds of miles. Really great light show. But unlike the United States, it's lit up like a Christmas tree. As you can see here, the outline of Florida and looking up the eastern coast of the United States. And we launched on a full moon. You can see the moon reflected on the ocean there. This is Los Angeles, and I can you all see this really well? Would it be better to turn the lights down? I've been looking at my slides, so I apologize if you can see it better. But I can. Where I grew up, my house in Los Angeles. So it's kind of fun. I'm sorry, I should have realized that earlier, but that's what happens when you're talking to the screen here and not looking at the screen up there. And this is Houston, looking at the Johnson Space Center, right in the center of the screen. And then the Kennedy Space Center is right here, and those are the two launch platforms, the vertical scale and the runway where we would land. And that's the kind of detail you can see with your naked eye. And going from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, again, takes about 8.5 minutes, depending on your exact ground track. And again, a commercial flight would be about 5 hours. So it gives you an idea of just how fast you're traveling to make that trip in 8 minutes or so. And I love this picture of Europe with the cities labeled, so I don't have to remember what each one is. And I just love this shot of Italy for some reason. And then you might recognize that little island there in the Mediterranean.
Sweet.
And then here's another beautiful shot, I think, of Cyprus. And another one with in the sun glint. And then a more close-up one of Cyprus. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a glimpse of what the views from orbit are like. And it's something you never, ever get tired of. Again, I'd like to just briefly shift gears. I'm not going to talk about it a long time, but just one of the things is astronaut training. One of the things I love about being an astronaut is you're constantly learning something new. You never stop learning. Here you see we have two simulators, a motion base for ascent entry training and a fixed base for orbit training. And then there's so many other wonderful jobs in the space program, one of which is being one of the flight controllers in mission control. Always requires a college degree in some area of science. And in addition to that, there's engineers, our trainers, there's just so many amazing jobs. It's a huge team that supports the crews on orbit. But we do a lot of our training standalone in the simulators I just showed you. And then we also do integrated training with mission control because we need to learn to work together as a team. And the boss of mission control is the flight director. Interestingly, although we picked the first women astronauts in 1978, we didn't have our first female flight director until 1984, Michelle Brecky. Now we have quite a few. As part of our training, we also, again, I'm talking a little bit now about the other programs. We have a full-scale mock-up of the pressurized portion of the International Space Station. This is where the crews do their emergency training. And it's the only full-scale mock-up of the space station. Each partner has a simulator of their part of the station, but this is the only place where they can train on the entire stack or entire space station. And then we have a facility, a swimming pool, a really large swimming pool, which is called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. And this is where we do our training for spacewalks. So there's a platform where you get inside your spacesuit. This is a shuttle suit. The one I showed you earlier that I was in was actually an Apollo suit. The Apollo suit was a one-piece suit. Did not have the same mobility in the shoulders because they really weren't going to be doing as much work as we had to do in the shuttle program. So you really needed the shoulder mobility. For any of you that are interested in exercise and so forth, because we do so much work in the water in these suits, we have a lot of shoulder rotator cuff injuries. And as we're looking at designing the new suits for the future, we're trying to learn from that and have a design that doesn't cause that kind of injury. So then you get into the water in the suit, and they have lead weights around your legs that you can see in the picture here, and your arms, and then they weigh you out to make you neutrally buoyant. But physically, this is the hardest training we do, and it's really tough, I'll have to say. And then you get in the water and you go through whatever your specific task is. And the other thing we use that swimming pool for is to practice our procedures in case we ever had to bail out of the shuttle. Of course, there's only a very small window in the profile where you're even at a velocity and altitude where you could bail out. But in the slight chance that you are there, you have to learn. I don't know if you've ever tried to get into your raft when you're wearing a flight suit and boots. It's not easy, I can tell you. And so we also use it for that. And we have a small fleet of T-38s, which is how the pilots maintain their proficiency as pilots. So they fly in the front seat, and those of us that are mission specialists fly in the back seat. We're responsible for the navigation and communication. And the one thing that's also really special about our T-38s is almost all of our training is in simulators, with the exception of the T-38. And when you're in a simulator, you know at the back of your mind that you might make a bad mistake, but you're not going to die. You might die of embarrassment from your stupid mistake, but you're not going to actually die. In a T-38, that's not the case. You can have malfunctions, you can have bad weather, so it is the most realistic environment that we can train in. And last, throughout most of my training, we didn't have iPhones, so we weren't taking a lot of pictures and selfies and things like everybody nowadays likes to do, but I was flying in the back seat one day, and I happened to have my iPhone in my pocket, and so this is my selfie that I took while I was in the T-38. Finally, just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing currently, what our current programs are. The International Space Station had the first people go on board in October of 2000. So next year we're approaching our 20th anniversary. Sometimes I find that hard to believe because, as was mentioned in the introduction, I was chief of the space station branch as we were just figuring out how we were going to build this amazing structure and how we were going to operate it and work with our international partners. It was almost as much fun as going into space. And so, I don't see that program ending anytime soon. It's funded through 2024, but there's a lot of talk about letting the commercial world take over the International Space Station. So it might even be possible for people to get a chance to fly on board the International Space Station in the future through that, whatever organization or entity is selected to manage it. Because I don't see any reason why it won't last well beyond its design life, and certainly well beyond 2024. And this is just one of the neat pictures that the shuttle took as it is backing away and flying around the station as it was departing. This is the current crew that's on board the International Space Station. Kind of unique in that Luca Parmitano is the commander in the center. He's an Italian astronaut. You might remember he's the astronaut a couple of years ago that was doing a spacewalk and almost drowned in his spacesuit when he had a malfunction that brought water into the helmet. I don't think a lot of people realize just how close we came to losing him. And then cosmonauts, two cosmonauts, and the U.S. astronauts, and then Jessica Meir, the second from the right, and Christine Koch were the first two women to do a spacewalk together a couple of weeks ago. And that was a really neat, wonderful milestone, certainly for the women in the program. And my good friend Stephanie Wilson was the Capcom in mission control, so that was a pretty amazing spacewalk that occurred a couple weeks ago. So the shuttle, as I mentioned, we flew 135 missions, and it stopped flying in July of 2011. And this is one of my favorite shots of the shuttle on the pad at sunset. And, you know, after the shuttle stopped flying, we didn't have a vehicle for taking humans up to the International Space Station from U.S. soil. And so we paid approximately $70 million a seat for every astronaut we launched since July of 2011 up until the present. So it was a matter of some importance for us to try to come up and design new vehicles from the U.S. side. So we have two programs. One is the Commercial Crew Program, and it is, we already had a Commercial Crew Program for taking cargo up to the International Space Station, but we had no way of taking astronauts, humans, up to the International Space Station. So we selected the Boeing Starliner, which is on your left, I think, and the SpaceX Crew Dragon. And those are under design right now. Actually, the SpaceX has already flown its unmanned test flight. Its next flight will be manned. Boeing is scheduled to fly its unmanned test flight this month. And so it will fly its manned test flight next year. So hopefully next year, both of these vehicles will be launching from the Kennedy Space Center. And remember, they were designed purely to fly astronauts from Florida to the International Space Station. I was actually hoping that the Sierra Nevada would be selected, the Dream Chaser, and it is being designed and developed to carry cargo. And I'm hopeful that one of these days it'll be human rated as well. But in the meantime, we have the Starliner and the Crew Dragon. And then so that's what the Commercial Crew Program is working on. And what NASA is working on is the, let me go back there, the Orion vehicle, which is basically like the Apollo capsule, just a little bit bigger. It's designed for 4 people for up to 23 days. And it will be taking crews not to low Earth orbit, where we've been stuck since the end of the Apollo program, but to go beyond low Earth orbit and hopefully back to the moon and on to Mars. So these are mock-ups of the 3 different capsules. In the far back is the Orion capsule, and in the foreground is the SpaceX Dragon on the left and the Boeing Starliner, just to give you a perspective. So there are actually 3 vehicles under development at this time. Orion is, I believe, on schedule to fly its first unmanned test flight either late next year or early the year after that. And we've already announced crews for the first 2 missions for those flights. The crews on the left, on your left, are for the Boeing Starliner, and the 4 crew members on the right are flying the first 2 flights of the Dragon capsule. And President Trump announced that he wants us to be back on the moon by 2024. I hope he's able to get us the budget that we can do that. I have no doubt NASA can do that if we're given an adequate budget. I think it's going to be very much like the bases that we have in Antarctica, which is an international base where you can do research and with participation for anyone that would like to. And so that's what I'm hoping is going to happen, and it's what we're headed towards. We're actually building a small space station called Gateway that's going to orbit the moon, and so then the Orion vehicle will dock to that, and then from that docked combination, we'll have a lunar lander that you'll go down to the moon from. But the ultimate goal of going to the moon is not to go back to the moon, but to go to the moon and learn the techniques and the things we need to know so we can successfully go on to Mars. That is the ultimate goal. And but just to remind everyone just how far away Mars is and why the moon is an important first step. This is a picture that was taken by the Mars rover, and it's a picture of Earth. Most of the older people in the audience are probably in that picture, but I think visually that lets you realize just how far away Mars is. And I'd like to end with this slide. My grandmother passed away in 2003 at the age of 105. She was born in 1898, and I marvel sometimes at what she saw in her lifetime. You know, she was born in the horse and buggy days and saw the first development of flight and commercial airlines, to seeing the first man walk on the moon, to seeing her granddaughter launch into space on the shuttle. And to me, that's just an amazing amount of things to happen in her very long lifetime, but actually a very short time when you look at, you know, geologic time. With the way technology is changing, I cannot imagine what you young folks in the audience are going to see if you're lucky enough to live to be 100 and 105. I think it's pretty amazing. I think it's really exciting. I love the international aspects of our space program. The thing I love most about space, it's one of those few things that actually brings the people of the Earth all together, as when they were watching the Apollo 11 moon landing. And so, for me, that was the thing that I loved most about being a part of the space program. So with that, I think I'll stop talking and answer any questions you might have.
All right, you got questions? You got a microphone right in front of you? Or if you push the button.
That's really cool.
All right.
I've been in a lecture hall that has microphones.
So if you need to make corrections on the rendezvous point for the satellites, how do you exactly say that? Do you go one click north, go one click east?
Oh, well, you know, the rendezvous is all programmed pretty much up until about the last 500 feet or so. And then at that point, we have a star tracker in the overhead windows, and we're kind of going to the center of the crosshairs in there. And then basically, yes, it's just like, but we use up, down, left, and right as you're flying. That's just how the pilots train. And you know, you can really come up with any way of communicating what you're doing that works for you. But yes, it would be like one click up, 2 clicks down to join up with the satellite. Interesting thing also, like when I was operating the arm, Joe and Dale were 2 very different personalities. Dale was a rigorous engineer. He had also operated the robotic arm. So when he talked to me and he was on the end of the arm, he would give me directions, practically talking what I would call arm speak, arm direction. Joe had never operated the arm, and he would just say, go up, go down, do this. And I just learned, the 2 of them communicated differently and just learned how to maneuver them where they wanted to go. Plus I could look out the window and see where they wanted to go. So, but communication about what you're doing in space is really important.
Hi, Dr. Fisher. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. It's really interesting and fantastic to have someone who's been up there talking directly to us. So thank you so much. I just wanted to ask something about the future of technology development and maybe get your inside view on the direct fusion drive and whether you feel that's progressing or if you think there are other engines that can be developed or are being developed that would become the future of propulsion.
Well, that's not really my area of expertise, But I do know that one of my fellow astronauts is working on a plasma ion engine, and that's showing a lot of promise. And I think it has a lot of merit, and I think that it's possible that that will be what's eventually chosen. The only problem is it requires a lot of power. And so I really think that eventually we're going to have to be able to use nuclear power in space. So I'm not sure how we get the world over the fact that they don't want to launch things with nuclear power. But you know, if you've seen the movie Gravity, that was an important thing that they used. So, just trying to get power with solar arrays and to get enough power is really tough. And a plasma ion engine will probably get us to Mars 3 months, something like that, much, much faster than anything else that we're currently looking at. But there are a lot of smarter people than me working on that. I have no doubt that we can solve that. If we decide that we are going to Mars and we want to do it and get adequate funding, I have no doubt we'll figure it out, but it's still a little ways off. Any more questions? Sorry. Push the button.
Regarding basically your last comments, I would like your personal view about moving the humanity to Mars and what kind of problems could that cause for all of us?
Well, I think it'll be a long time before we move humanity to Mars. I'm just talking about, you know, like in the book The Martian, sending up our first cruise and learning how to live on another body other than Earth. I think there's a lot we need to learn before we talk about establishing, you know, communities on board, living on either the moon or Mars, which in our solar system look like the only really two options we have at the moment. But who knows? I mean, it's such a, one of the things that's really hard about the space program is predicting how much support you're going to get. If you had asked me when I first was selected an astronaut, I would have thought we'd been to Mars by now. Every single person in my class, that was what we were signing up to do. The shuttle was just a step. And so I think we're all excited to be a part of the space program, but a little bit frustrated that we're not going faster. But even as fast as we go, I think it's going to be a long time before actual people live on another body. It would be more like what I said, the base in Antarctica for doing research for the foreseeable future, when we will ever be ready to send humans, you know, with families, for example, to live, like, you know, like in the old days of exploration, or in the United States when we went from the east to explore the west. I think that's quite a long ways off. Yes.
I'd like to ask, do you think the reason there haven't been any moon landings for the last 50 years, is it purely financial, or are there other reasons as well?
Mostly financial, I think, and also I think in the United States it was just a loss of interest. You know, they said, I mean, really it was the Cold War with the then Soviet Union that spurred the interest in the United States, and the competition and the willingness to fund whatever it took. After they had done that a few times, and I even see that with the shuttle program and pretty much everything we do. People that aren't real space nuts tend to get bored, and they don't realize the importance and all the benefits and things they do derive from it. But there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't have already been to the moon and set up a base. It's just political and national will. I know President Trump is really wants to do that. Again, you know, we have our election coming up next year, and who knows what's going to happen. And we were definitely on path and would already have a vehicle now, but President Obama canceled the Constellation program in 2010. And we basically lost a lot of time and $5 billion that had been invested up to that point. So we never knew that's one of the really big problems in the space program, certainly in the United States. There's no long-term plan that once it's selected, you have to stay on that course unless some technical reason comes up why you can't. But every administration that comes along has different priorities, and basically the reason we haven't done more is the lack of those priorities and the funding to go with it. Many of the presidents announced, oh, we're going to do this or we're going to do that, but they didn't provide the funding to do it. So we'll see now what happens. Vice President Pence is very supportive of the space program, and he's who President Trump has kind of put in charge of all of that. So we'll have to see, but right now, I don't know if you follow politics in the United States, but it's hard to get anyone's attention about anything else other than who's going to be elected president next year.
Hello, Anna.
Hi.
Thanks for coming to Cyprus to give us some of your flame. I would like to say that you have such an outstanding CV. You finished medical, then you became an astronaut. So I'm wondering how a person can be so committed to his goal and what drives him. So could you please give us some advices to any of us that would like to reach our goals, whatever they may be?
Well, remember at the beginning I said I was a real nerd when I was young. I liked doing math homework. When I told my two daughters I actually liked doing math homework, they thought I was nuts. But I was really shy, so I didn't really have an option of, I didn't have any vocal talent, so, you know, I wasn't going to be a singer. I was too shy to go into theater or anything like that. But I was good at math and science. And I always knew, from the time I showed you that picture, the first slide, I always knew I wanted to do something that I really believed in. It was more important to me to have a career that where I felt I was doing something important that was much more motivating to me than how much money I was going to make. I mean, I wanted to make a decent living, but I needed more than just that. And from as long as I can remember, to me, space exploration does that. It is, I think we're on the beginning of our first steps of leaving our planet. And just to be part of those first steps, whether it's 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years. And that everything went your way. And in some areas I was very lucky. But for instance, I didn't get into medical school the first time I applied because I applied very late. I made my decision to go to medical school very late. And I was really I got on the waiting list for UCLA and didn't make it in. So I spent a year in graduate school in chemistry. I was really disappointed when I didn't get into medical school that first time. But that year in graduate school actually turned out to be very valuable. One, just valuable to me in my education and my self-confidence. But also, when NASA selected people for my class, they still weren't quite sure what mission specialists were going to do. And so they wanted people with two backgrounds in two fields. So I had a background in chemistry and a background in medicine. So that year that initially was very disappointing to me turned out to actually be useful. So I'd like to share that. And along the way, everybody in the astronaut office, if you can imagine, these are people that have done well in high school, and they get in college and they get really good grades because they're going on to get their PhD or get into medical school. And then you take all these type A personalities and put them all in the same office. Everyone wants to be the first one to do this, the first one to do that. And so, so people were disappointed, even though they're an astronaut. And sometimes you have to step back and say, I am very lucky to be here, whether I fly first or whether I fly last. And so, it's just important, I think, really to look inside yourself as to what you want. And then the other advice I always give is be persistent. I found out, I've been in NASA a long time when some of my friends that I think very highly of applied 6 or 7 times before they got selected as an astronaut. And we only have selections approximately every 2 years. So somebody who applied 6 or 7 times, you're talking 12 or 14 years. So that is persistence, probably the definition of it. But so it's hard to, sometimes too, I think being driven is a good thing, but sometimes too you need to learn to relax. And I still have trouble learning how to relax because, there are just so many things I still want to do.
Hi. So, first of all, thank you, Dr. Fisher, for coming, and thank you for making this so personable as well. It's so nice to relate to your stories about your family and the whole process. I just want to ask you, you mentioned something about the simulation experience, and you stated that even in the back of your mind, you knew that it was not real, right? Was there ever a moment, though, that even for a split of a second, you thought that this was actually happening and it brought doubt in actually maybe going into space or continuing the process?
Because when you're in a simulator, you always know you're in a simulator. I think the more fearful thing when you're in a simulator and training is kind of what I said, that you're going to make a stupid mistake and embarrass yourself. And in much of the training we do, there's a whole team of people. Like when you're on a shuttle crew, there's a training team. There's not just one person sitting there listening to any dumb thing you do. There's a whole team. And when you're doing an integrated sim, there's that whole mission control. When you're doing one of those runs in the water, there's a whole team of people of about, I'd say 20 to 30 people in the control room, monitoring the systems, the safety divers. So everything you're doing, you're always doing in front of a large group of people. And if you make a dumb mistake, a large number of people are going to see it. One of my colleagues, who I shall not name, was actually on the shuttle, and we're going in an actual launch countdown, and he or she accidentally engaged the backup flight control system. Huge thing to do in an actual, that wasn't even a simulator, but still, you're on the ground. Those kind of mistakes, everybody remembers forever. So it's more that kind of fear of making a stupid mistake. The fear factor really doesn't come in, fear for your life, until you actually go into space. One other thing I should really quickly mention, kind of along the lines that you answered, I forgot. I think it was briefly mentioned, I took a 7-year leave of absence to stay home with my daughters. And that was a very, very hard, first of all, I didn't decide I was going to stay home for 7 years. And each year I talked with my boss and made a decision that I wasn't quite ready to come back yet. And I look back, and that was definitely a hard decision, because I love being an astronaut, but I also love being a mom, and I knew I would never get those years back with my daughters. And even now, I do not regret doing it. But coming back after being away for 7 years was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because the office had totally changed by the time I came back. All my friends had gone, in general, the way people's career in the astronaut world goes is you come in, you stay about 10 or 12 years, you fly once, twice, 3 times, however luck and skill gets you. And then they generally go on either into industry, aerospace industry, or go back to academia and teaching and so forth. So when I came back, most of my friends were all gone. And when I left, nobody had computers. We did all of our, the way we stated a position was we would write a memo and you would circulate, and I mean physically circulate a memo to the key people to read. And you would have meetings when you had an issue that you needed to discuss. So I come back, and the first thing they do is give me a computer, and I go, what's this? And all of a sudden, the whole world had changed. The whole way you do business was via email and PowerPoint and all that sort of stuff. So it was probably, looking back, the hardest thing I ever did, and to earn everybody's confidence and respect. And but it turned out to actually be very advantageous for both me and for NASA, because there was nobody left who remembered what it was like before the shuttle flew. And now we were before the station flew. And a lot of my fellow colleagues were being very unrealistic, particularly in dealing with our Russian colleagues, because their way of training and doing things is very different than ours. We've kind of come to a middle ground now that we all enjoy. But back in the early days, it was not like that. And so I was kind of the only person who could go to the chief of the office and say, the shuttle was just like this at the beginning. It was not, the training was not great. The procedures had a lot to be desired. We did a lot of improvement when Challenger happened. We basically rewrote our entire procedures and books during that downtime. And so it turned out that because of my taking a leave, I came back and I was kind of in the right place at the right time, and to help the office over that hump at the beginning. And now I can't believe we're on expedition 62, whatever it is. Amazing. I would have never believed we would get this far and do all the amazing things we did. So again, you kind of have to, each person has to make all these personal decisions and how you balance a career and family, and every person is different, every need is different, every family is different. But yeah, coming back after you've been gone a long time was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, second to leaving Kristen to go into space. Any more questions?
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Fisher. Then, if you'd like to take a picture with Dr. Fisher, it's going to be one row. It's going to be down. We're going to take a picture with you there. Is that okay with you, Dr. Fisher?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. So please do not. It's going to be over there. Thank you very much.
I always love talking to students that understand about it. Learning PowerPoint is the hardest thing to do that.
Listo, Cosmo.